My uncle's legs were shaking. That's the detail I keep coming back to. Not the silence that swallowed the entire dining room, not the sound of 17 people stopping mid-chew, not even my daughter's voice, steady, impossibly steady for an 8-year-old, cutting through every conversation, every assumption, every ugly thing that had been said in that house for the past 4 years. It was his legs. Underneath the table, behind the linen napkins and the good china my mother only brought out twice a year, his legs were shaking so hard the table rattled. He tried to cover it by reaching for his wine glass. His hand wasn't steady enough to grab it on the first try. My daughter stood in the center of the dining room on Thanksgiving Day, November 23rd, 2023, holding her iPhone 14 in both hands. She was 8 years old and wearing the burgundy velvet dress we'd picked out together at Nordstrom 3 weeks earlier. She'd said it made her feel like a queen. I hadn't argued. She was right. And in that moment, standing in the middle of 32 people who had gone completely silent, she looked more like a queen than anyone else in that room. Let me tell you how we got here, because the recording was only the final piece. And it only meant what it meant because of everything that came before it. To understand this Thanksgiving, you have to understand the Hargrove family, my maiden name. The family I married into when I was 26 and divorced out of when I was 31, except that divorcing Derek Hargrove turned out to be the easy part. Divorcing his family, that took years I'm still living through. My daughter, Nora, is Derek's daughter too. And in the eyes of Derek's family, particularly his brother Marcus and Marcus's wife Claudette, Nora was never quite the right kind of Hargrove. Too quiet. Too bookish. Too much like me, which in their estimation was not a compliment. Marcus Hargrove is 44 years old and has worked in commercial real estate in Atlanta since 2009. He's made a good living. He'll tell you about it whether you ask or not. He drives a 2022 BMW 7 Series in Alpine White, which he mentions to strangers within 12 minutes of meeting them. I counted once. He and Claudette live in a 6,000-square-foot house in Buckhead that they refinanced in 2021 to fund a renovation they haven't finished. I know this because Derek told me, back when Derek and I were still on speaking terms, which we haven't been since March of 2022 when he stopped paying child support for 4 consecutive months, and I had to involve a family attorney. The Hargrove Thanksgiving was technically Derek's year. We had alternated since the divorce was finalized in December 2020, and I had spent the 2021 and 2022 holidays building something that had nothing to do with turkey or family seating charts. But in 2023, I agreed to attend. My attorney, Sharon Beckett of Beckett and Lowe Family Law in Midtown Atlanta, had advised me to demonstrate good faith in co-parenting ahead of a custody modification hearing we had scheduled for February 2024. So I showed up. I brought a sweet potato casserole from Whole Foods, which Claudette immediately relocated to the kitchen counter, away from the main table, where she'd arranged dishes she had actually cooked herself. Nora and I arrived at 2:15 in the afternoon. By 2:47, Nora had disappeared upstairs to play. I noticed because I always notice where Nora is. Old habit from years of navigating spaces where I wasn't entirely sure she was safe. Not physically, the Hargroves weren't that kind of dangerous. The kind where adults say things in front of children that they shouldn't, and then look at you like you're the problem for being bothered by it. The first incident I can point to happened at Christmas 2021. Nora was 6 years old and she'd gotten a chapter book from the school book fair, a Junie B. Jones she'd been talking about for 2 weeks. She brought it to the Hargrove Christmas dinner and was reading quietly in the corner while the adults talked. Marcus leaned over to Derek and said, loudly enough for the entire room to hear, "She's going to be one of those weird kids who doesn't know how to talk to people." He wasn't whispering. He thought it was funny. Derek laughed. Claudette smiled into her eggnog. Nora was 6 years old and she looked up from her book for exactly 3 seconds before looking back down. I saw her absorb it. I watched it land. And I said nothing, because Sharon had told me that creating scenes at family events would hurt me in mediation. The second incident was Easter 2022. Nora had just lost her first tooth and she was excited about it, in that full-body way that 6-year-olds get excited, talking about the tooth fairy and what she was going to do with the dollar and whether the fairy had wings or not. Claudette waited until Nora paused for breath and said, "That's very sweet, honey. Don't you have friends you could tell this to?" The table laughed. Nora went quiet for the rest of the meal. On the drive home, she asked me why Aunt Claudette didn't like her. I told her some people weren't good at talking to kids. I did not tell her the truth, which was that Claudette was small in the specific way that people are small when they've spent their whole lives being told they're exceptional. The third incident happened at a birthday party in July 2022, Marcus's daughter Bethany's 9th birthday at their house in Buckhead. Nora was invited because not inviting her would have been too obvious. She spent most of the party reading on a pool chair while the other kids played in the water. I sat beside her. Marcus came over at some point and said to me, not quietly, "She's such a burden, isn't she? I don't understand why you even keep her from having a normal childhood." He meant it as a critique of my parenting. I sat with it for a moment, the specific silence that I'd learned to use in those situations, and then I said, "She's exactly who she should be." He made a face and walked away. I noted the date in my phone. July 17th, 2022. I had started keeping notes. By October 2022, I had been promoted to Senior Director of Strategic Accounts at Mercer Consulting Group, where I'd worked since 2018. My base salary had moved to $118,000 with a performance bonus that had come in at $24,000 the previous year. The Hargroves believed I worked in something with numbers and made a modest income. Derek had told them early in our divorce that I'd struggled financially, which had been true in 2020 when I was navigating a divorce, a 4-year-old, and a job market that had just been rearranged by a pandemic. It was not true in 2022, but the Hargroves had filed that early information and hadn't updated it. I didn't correct them. There was something they didn't know about. Something I'd been building quietly since January 2021, in the hours between Nora's bedtime and midnight, and on Saturday mornings when Nora was at Derek's. I'd been making calls. Careful calls to careful people about a specific opportunity I'd identified inside my industry. I'd spent 3 years building it from nothing, and by October 2022, it was no longer nothing. I didn't know it yet, but Marcus had been having his own conversations that same fall. Conversations with Derek about their father's estate, Edward Hargrove SR, who was 73, in declining health, and in possession of a family trust that had been established in 2004 and last updated in 2019. I only found out about those conversations later, much later, when it mattered. The thing about the Hargrove family is that they operated on a hierarchy that had nothing to do with merit or effort. It was entirely about belonging. And I had belonged, briefly, when I was Derek's wife. The divorce had reclassified me as an outsider who happened to share custody of a Hargrove, which meant Nora existed in a strange middle space. She was a Hargrove by blood and an inconvenience by circumstance. And Marcus, who had appointed himself the family's unofficial managing partner, had made clear through 4 years of small comments and large silences that he considered both of us temporary problems that would eventually resolve themselves. I had exactly 18 months to prepare before things would come to a head. I knew this because of a document I'd read in September 2022, a copy of Edward Hargrove SR.'s existing trust, which a source I won't name had made available to me. The trust named Marcus as primary trustee. It named Derek and Marcus as equal primary beneficiaries. There was a provision for grandchildren, including Nora, contingent on several conditions that had been written vaguely enough to be interpreted almost any way a trustee wanted to interpret them. The trust was worth approximately $2.3 million in real property, an investment account at Fidelity valued at $890,000, and a commercial property in Decatur that generated $45,000 a year in rental income. I had understood immediately what that document meant and what it would mean when Edward SR. passed, which his cardiologist had indicated, through channels I also won't name, was likely within 18 to 24 months. I called Sharon Beckett the morning after I read the trust. She referred me to a colleague who specialized in trust litigation. His name was Robert Anand, and he worked out of a firm called Anand, Whitfield and Moss on Peachtree Road. Our first meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. I paid his consultation fee of $450 out of my own account. I did not tell Derek. I did not tell anyone. When I left Robert Annan's office at 4:15 in the afternoon on September 14, 2022, I had the beginning of a plan and a list of things I needed to build before I could execute it. The first thing I needed was my own financial independence, fully documented, fully verifiable, traceable to nothing that could be challenged as Derek's contribution or Hargrove money. I'd been working on this since the divorce, but I accelerated it dramatically in late 2022. By November 2022, my personal investment account at Schwab held $127,000. My 401k through Mercer had $84,000. I had purchased a condominium in Inman Park in March 2022 for $387,000, paying 22% down from savings I'd accumulated over 18 months. The mortgage was in my name only. The condo had appraised at $419,000 by October 2022, and I'd made no mention of it to anyone in the Hargrove orbit. Close call number 1 happened at Thanksgiving 2022, the year I skipped the Hargrove gathering and spent the holiday with Nora at my sister's house in Savannah. Derek called that evening, and I made the mistake of picking up. He was asking, ostensibly, about Nora's school schedule. But then, someone told me you bought a place in Inman Park. I don't know who told him. I kept my voice flat. I've been renting there for a while, I said. You know how Atlanta rents are. Technically, I was renting the condo to myself as a self-managed property. The LLC I'd formed in August 2022, Stonegate Residential LLC, registered in Georgia, held the property on paper. My name appeared as the managing member, but the paperwork was dense enough that a casual search wouldn't surface my connection easily. Derek didn't push further. He went back to talking about school schedules. I hung up the phone and stood in my sister's kitchen for a long moment, listening to the sound of Nora and her cousins playing down the hall. The second thing I needed was the business itself. Not Stonegate, that was real estate, a holding strategy. The business I'm talking about was something I'd been designing since January 2021, when I was still in the middle of the divorce and working remotely from a 2-bedroom apartment in Decatur that cost $1,450 a month and had a radiator that sounded like someone was trapped inside it. I had identified, through my work at Mercer, a significant gap in how mid-sized companies in the Southeast were handling vendor contract management. Mercer served the enterprise level. Nobody was adequately serving the middle market. I had spent 14 months researching this, building financial models at midnight on a second-hand desk I'd bought for $85 from Facebook Marketplace, using Excel and a copy of QuickBooks I'd gotten through Mercer's software licensing. By March 2023, I had incorporated the actual business, Sable Advisory Group, registered as an S corporation in Georgia. Initial capitalization was $62,000, drawn from my personal savings. I had 3 clients signed within 30 days of incorporation, companies I'd cultivated through professional relationships I'd built over 5 years at Mercer, carefully enough that there was no conflict of interest issue, and with enough distance from Mercer's own client list that there was no poaching question. My first quarterly revenue came in at $47,000. By June 2023, I was billing $68,000 per quarter. By September 2023, the business had generated $241,000 in gross revenue for the year to date. I told no one in the Hargrove family. I told my sister. I told my accountant, a woman named Patricia Kwon, who ran a small firm in Decatur and who had set up the S-Corp structure and was managing my quarterly estimated taxes with the efficiency of someone who'd been waiting her whole career for a client who actually kept organized records. I told Robert Anand because he needed to know the full picture. And I told Nora, in the simplified version that an 8-year-old can absorb, Mama has a new company and it's doing really well and we don't need to talk about it at Daddy's house. Close call number 2 happened in May 2023. I was at a school event, Nora's spring concert at Woodward Academy, and Claudette was there because Marcus and Claudette's youngest attended the same school. We were standing in the lobby afterward and Claudette said, with the particular brand of weaponized friendliness she'd mastered over the years, "I saw something on LinkedIn about a consulting firm with your name attached. Is that a new thing?" I had a response prepared. I'd prepared responses for most scenarios. "Side project," I said, "trying to pick up some freelance work, see if it goes anywhere." I smiled in a way that communicated mild embarrassment about ambition. Claudette nodded with visible satisfaction, the way people do when the world confirms what they already believed. "Smart to have a backup," she said. "These corporate jobs aren't as stable as they used to be." I thanked her. I went home and called Patricia Kwon to discuss restructuring the S-Corp's online presence to be less searchable. Close call number 3 was the most dangerous. October 2023, 5 weeks before Thanksgiving. Robert Anand called me on a Tuesday morning at 9:14 a.m. to tell me that Edward Hargrove SR had updated his trust. The update, which had been filed September 28th, significantly narrowed the conditions under which grandchildren could receive trust distributions. The new language specifically referenced primary residential address and consistent contact maintained by the custodial parent with the trustee, language that, according to Robert, appeared to have been drafted with the specific purpose of creating grounds to exclude Nora from her grandfather's trust. Marcus was the trustee. Marcus had presumably had input on the language. The attorney who drafted the amendment was someone Marcus had recommended to his father. I sat in my car in the parking garage of my office building on Peachtree Center Avenue for 18 minutes after that call. I did not cry. I've thought about why I didn't cry, and the honest answer is that by October 2023, I had spent 3 years building something specifically because I understood that people like Marcus would do exactly this kind of thing. I had prepared for it the way you prepare for weather. You don't cry when it rains. You check that your umbrella is in your bag. My umbrella was in my bag. I was 3 weeks from being fully ready when Marcus called Derek to announce that the family Thanksgiving would include a conversation about Grandpa's estate and that all relevant parties should plan to attend. The timing couldn't have been worse, or maybe it was exactly right. Thanksgiving, November 23, 2023, the Hargrove House in Buckhead. Marcus and Claudette had invited 32 people, which was more than they typically hosted, and which Robert Anand had noted when I told him, because a larger audience creates a particular kind of social pressure that Marcus likely understood and intended to use. Edward Hargrove SR was not there. He was at home with a caregiver in the house he'd lived in since 1987 in Dunwoody. He hadn't attended a family gathering since February. Marcus had power of attorney for healthcare decisions as of August 2023. He did not have financial power of attorney. That was still split between Derek and a family friend named Gerald Okonkwo, who I had spoken to twice in the previous month through Robert Annan's office. I arrived with Nora at 2:15. I was wearing a dark green wrap dress I'd bought at Nordstrom in October and low-heeled black boots. I had my phone, my bag, and a folder inside the bag that contained 4 documents I'd organized with Patricia Kwon and Robert Anand over the previous 2 weeks. The folder was inside a larger bag, along with Nora's Kindle, a small pouch of colored pencils, and a Ziploc bag of gummy bears I kept for situations where I needed Nora to occupy herself quietly. By 2:47, Nora had disappeared upstairs. I noted it but didn't worry immediately. The upstairs was familiar territory. She knew the layout, and she'd told me she wanted to play in the guest room where there was a closet full of board games. I settled into a conversation near the kitchen with Derek's cousin Vanessa, who was one of the few people in that house I considered uncomplicated. The afternoon moved. People arranged themselves the way they do at family events in the formations of old alliances and old grievances. Marcus held court near the fireplace. Claudette orchestrated the kitchen. Derek was in the living room with his new girlfriend, a woman named Paige who had been introduced to Nora for the first time that afternoon and who seemed, from a distance, to be handling it with reasonable grace. At 3:52 p.m., dinner was called. We moved to the dining room, 2 long tables pushed together to accommodate the group, the good china, the centerpiece Claudette had clearly spent significant effort on, linen napkins folded into something that required a tutorial. I found my seat, which was at the far end of the secondary table, between Vanessa and a cousin from Derek's mother's side I hadn't met before. Nora's seat was next to mine. It was empty. I assumed she'd come down when she heard people moving. Marcus stood at the head of the primary table and gave a toast that lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds. I timed it. He talked about family legacy, about his father's health and resilience, about the Hargrove name and what it meant to carry it forward. It was the kind of speech that sounds like generosity and is actually a territorial claim. At the end, he raised his glass and said, "To those of us who keep this family strong." He looked at Derek when he said it. He did not look at me. He did not look at Nora's empty chair. Nora came downstairs at 4:08. I know the time because I checked my phone when I heard her on the stairs, the particular sound of her footsteps, which I could identify in any building. She came to the table and sat beside me and didn't say anything. Her eyes were the specific kind of red that happens when someone has been crying and stopped. I reached under the table and put my hand on hers. She let me. She didn't explain. I looked across the table. Marcus was talking to the cousin from Derek's mother's side about a commercial property deal. He caught my eye briefly and looked away. An hour passed. The food was good, objectively. People talked around us in the way people do when they're comfortable and fed and surrounded by people who agree with them about the fundamental structure of the world. Nora ate carefully and quietly. At one point, she excused herself to the bathroom and came back with her phone in the pocket of her dress. I noticed. I didn't ask. At 5:11, Marcus made the joke. He'd been building to something. I could feel it in the way conversations had been organizing themselves around him for the past 30 minutes, the slight elevation in his own voice, the way Claudette had started filling and refilling glasses with a hostessing energy that signaled an event approaching. He said it to the general table, mid-conversation about something else, in the tone of someone offering an observation they're proud of. You know what Nora needs? She's too shy to have friends. She needs a social skills class or something. He laughed. A few people laughed with him. A few people were quiet. Vanessa, beside me, stopped moving her fork. Nora did not yell. She did not look at me for permission. She set down her fork, carefully, the way I'd taught her, pushed back her chair, stood up and walked to the center of the room. Not to the head of the table. To the actual center, the open space between the two pushed-together tables, where everyone could see her. She was small and she was in her burgundy velvet dress and she said, in a voice that did not shake, "I have something to say." 32 people stopped eating. She held up her phone. She pressed play. Marcus's own voice filled the dining room. From earlier that afternoon, from upstairs, from the hallway outside the guest room where he had apparently been having a conversation with Claudette. His voice, clear enough through the phone speaker, saying, "She's such a burden. I don't understand why my sister-in-law even keeps her." And then Claudette's voice, "She's just like her mother, going to grow up socially useless." And then Marcus again, "If we structure the trust right, we won't have to think about either of them after Dad is gone." The recording lasted 47 seconds. Marcus's face went through several stages in those 47 seconds. The first was a kind of blankness, not processing. The second was the beginning of red, the circulatory response to being publicly exposed that the body produces before the brain has finished its assessment. The third was the look at Claudette, fast and desperate, the look that said, "Fix this." Claudette's expression had gone to stone. Nora lowered her phone. "And another thing," she said, with the calm of someone who has decided that what comes next is simply necessary, "I heard you tell Grandma that my inheritance was going to be taken away. And that Mama didn't know." She paused. "But Mama does know." Every head turned to me. I had not planned this. I had planned many things for this Thanksgiving, but I had not planned my 8-year-old standing in the center of the room, because I had not known she was in that closet, and I had not known she had her phone recording. She had done this on her own, in the specific way that children absorb the dynamics of rooms and respond to them with a directness that adults have spent years learning to suppress. I stood up. The room was completely silent. Someone's phone buzzed somewhere in the house. Ice had melted in a glass near the end of the table and no one had touched it. I said, "Marcus, I'd like to talk about Grandpa's trust." Marcus's jaw moved before his voice engaged. "This isn't the time or place." "You scheduled a conversation about the estate for today," I said. "That's why we're all here, isn't it? Let's have it." I reached into my bag. I pulled out the folder. Marcus looked at the folder the way people look at things they suspect are dangerous. A pause, 2 seconds too long. "What is that?" "Documentation," I said. "Let's start with the trust amendment." I had a copy of the September 28th trust amendment. Robert Anand had obtained it through proper channels. The document was filed with the probate court and was part of the public record once Edward S.R. had executed it. I set it on the table. I did not slide it toward Marcus. I laid it flat in front of myself and described its contents to the room. The amendment, which was filed on September 28th, narrows the grandchildren's distribution conditions using language that references primary residential address and consistent contact with the trustee. I looked at Marcus. "You're the trustee." The language effectively gives you discretion to exclude Nora from her grandfather's estate. I'd like to know when you drafted this language and who provided it to the drafting attorney. The corner of Marcus's mouth twitched. He shifted in his chair. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," I said. I'm asking a direct question. Derek had been silent since the recording played. He was at the far end of the primary table, and his face had the quality of someone watching a car accident, unable to look away, unable to intervene. His girlfriend Paige had put both hands flat on the table in the posture of someone who has decided their safest option is perfect stillness. Vanessa had stopped pretending to look at her plate. I opened the folder to the second document. Robert Anand of Anand, Whitfield and Moss reviewed the trust amendment in October 2023, I said. His assessment, which is in writing, is that the amendment as written contains provisions that are potentially challengeable under Georgia trust law, specifically the Georgia Trust Code, Title 53, Chapter 12. The vagueness of the contact requirement in relation to the trustee, who is not a neutral party, creates a conflict of interest that Robert believes constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty. The color had started to drain from Marcus's face. His hand stopped mid-gesture toward his wine glass. "You have a lawyer," Marcus said. His voice came out different. Higher, tighter. "I have a lawyer," I confirmed. "I've had one since September 2022. Claudette said, from her end of the table, "This is not appropriate for a family dinner." "Claudette?" I said her name once with no particular weight on it, and she stopped. I don't know why she stopped. I think she stopped because the room had shifted and she could feel it. "Your husband made plans for my daughter's inheritance. He recorded himself describing my daughter as a burden. We're going to talk about it." Marcus pushed back from his end of the table. Not standing, just creating distance from the table in the way people do when they need to feel less contained. "You have no standing here. You're not a Hargrove. You're an ex-wife. You don't have any rights in my father's estate." "You're right that I don't have rights in the estate," I said. "Nora does. As Edward Hargrove S.R.'s biological granddaughter, she has standing as an interested party. And as her custodial parent, I have the ability to pursue her interests on her behalf." I opened the folder to the third document. "Which is why, on November 8, 2023, Robert Anand filed a formal notice with the probate court identifying Nora as an interested party in the Edward Hargrove S.R. Trust and requesting an independent review of the September 28th amendment." The paper in Marcus's hand, a napkin he'd been holding, I noticed only now shook. "You filed," Marcus said. "We filed," I said. 15 days ago, you should have been notified. If you weren't, your attorney may have a process problem." Derek spoke for the first time since the recording had played. "You filed something in probate court without telling me." I looked at Derek. "I didn't know you were involved in the amendment discussions," I said. "Were you?" Derek's face answered before he did. He hadn't been involved. He looked at Marcus with an expression that was recalibrating several years of assumptions simultaneously. We'd been in that dining room for 22 minutes since Nora had stood up. Someone's ice had melted completely in a glass near the end of the secondary table. Nobody was drinking. Marcus tried to recover. He straightened in his chair. He put both hands flat on the table, a physical anchoring maneuver. "I'm the trustee," he said, with the deliberateness of someone reading from a document inside their own head. "My father gave me that role. My decisions about the trust are within my authority." "Within limits," I said. "The fiduciary duty limits. A trustee cannot act against the interests of the beneficiaries. A grandchild who is a named beneficiary, even conditionally, has protection under that duty." I paused. "And there's a secondary issue." Marcus looked at me. "The commercial property in Decatur," I said. "The one that generates approximately $45,000 a year in rental income. According to the 2019 trust document, that property was to be maintained as a trust asset and the income distributed annually to all beneficiaries. According to the rental income records I obtained, that income has not been distributed. It's been deposited into an account associated with a Hargrove Holdings LLC, which you formed in January 2021. I looked at him steadily. "Would you like to explain where the $135,000 in rental income from the past 3 years has gone?" Marcus's voice came out not at all. For 4 full seconds, nobody in that dining room said anything. I heard someone's chair scrape on the hardwood in the living room, someone who had positioned themselves near the dining room door, listening. I heard Nora, beside me, exhale. Marcus's face went from pale to red to pale again in the space of about 10 seconds. He turned to Claudette. Claudette was looking at the table. He turned to Derek. Derek was looking at me. Where did you get those records? Marcus finally said, rental income records for commercial properties are part of tax filings, I said. Robert Anand has forensic accounting resources. It wasn't complicated. This was partially true. The full truth involved an introduction Robert had arranged with a forensic accountant named James Tillman, whom I'd paid $3,200 for a preliminary analysis. James had found the Hargrove Holdings LLC and the income diversion within 6 hours. It had cost me $3,200 to find $135,000. I considered that an acceptable ratio. Vanessa, beside me, quietly stood up, collected her plate and her glass, and moved to a different seat, further from Marcus, more clearly adjacent to me. She didn't say anything. She just moved. Derek's cousin from the other side of the family pushed back slightly from the table, not leaving, just creating distance from Marcus. Marcus said, in the voice of a man attempting to reassemble something that had broken, those funds were being held for estate management purposes. My father authorized. Does your father know? Derek said. The silence after that question was a different kind of silence. The kind that happens when someone says the one thing that can't be unsaid. I put the fourth document on the table. This is a letter, I said, from Gerald Okonkwo, who holds co-financial power of attorney with Derek. Gerald retained independent counsel in October 2023 after I contacted him through Robert Anand. He has concerns about the management of the Decatur property income. I paused. Gerald will be filing his own petition with the probate court. It's already drafted. He asked me to let you know today, at this gathering, since you assembled most of the relevant parties anyway. I watched Marcus fold. There's no other word for it. I watched him fold into his chair the way something structural collapses, not dramatic, not explosive, but a settling inward, a loss of the architecture that had been holding the shape. His hands went to the table and stayed there. He didn't speak. Claudette, at her end of the table, had reached for her wine glass and put it down without drinking. Derek put his face in his hands. And another thing, I said, because there was one more, and because Nora had used those exact words, and because some moments have a shape that asks you to follow it, the amendment to the trust wasn't properly witnessed. Robert identified this in October. 2 of the 3 required witness signatures on the September 28th amendment were employees of the law firm that drafted it. Under Georgia Trust Code Section 5312(9), that's a procedural defect that exposes the amendment to challenge. Robert will be raising it in the probate review. The amendment may be voided. I closed my folder, which would revert the trust to the 2019 version. The version where Nora's distribution is not conditional on your assessment of her relationship with your family. Nobody spoke. We'd been in that room for 31 minutes, I noted afterward, when I was writing everything down for Robert Anand. 31 minutes to undo 4 years of planning. Marcus's legs were shaking under the table. The tablecloth moved slightly with it. He'd stopped trying to reach for his glass. The room had rearranged itself the way rooms do when the weight shifts. People who had been adjacent to Marcus, physically, in terms of seating, in terms of the way they'd been orienting their attention toward him, had quietly adjusted. Not dramatically. Small movements. A chair turned. A gaze redirected. Vanessa was now fully turned toward me. Derek's cousin had found something very interesting to look at on her own plate. Derek's girlfriend Paige had, at some point in the preceding 10 minutes, stopped being still and started being present, watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Nora was sitting beside me with her hands folded in her lap. She had not said anything since her last statement. She was 8 years old and she had done everything she needed to do. I looked at Marcus one more time. I'd like Nora to have a relationship with her grandfather, I said. I've never tried to prevent that. I'm not starting now, but I won't allow anyone to use the trust as a mechanism to communicate to my daughter that she doesn't belong in this family. We clear? Marcus said nothing. We're clear, Derek said, from the far end of the table. The probate court scheduled a formal review for January 14, 2024. Robert Anand filed a comprehensive challenge to the September 28th amendment on December 3rd, citing the witness signature defect and the fiduciary conflict of interest. Gerald Okonkwo filed his petition on December 9th. The Decatur property income discrepancy is now part of a separate forensic accounting review being conducted by a court-appointed assessor. Marcus retained his own attorney in late November, someone outside Atlanta, which Robert interpreted as Marcus trying to avoid professional circles where his reputation was established. Marcus resigned as trustee in January 2024, 6 days before the scheduled probate hearing. Derek was named interim trustee, pending the court's review. The 2019 trust terms were reinstated as the operative document while the legal process continues. Nora's distribution rights under the 2019 terms are not conditional on Marcus's assessment of anything. Marcus and Claudette did not attend Nora's school winter concert in December. They have not been in contact with me. The Buckhead renovation, according to Vanessa, is still unfinished. The BMW appears to still be alpine white. Nora has been fine. She asked me, on the drive home from Thanksgiving, whether she did the right thing. I told her she did. She asked me if Grandpa's trust was going to be okay. I told her that people were working on it. She nodded and looked out the window for the rest of the drive and then asked if we could stop at Chick-fil-A. We stopped at Chick-fil-A. For 2 months after Thanksgiving, everything was quiet. The legal process moved through its channels. Patricia Kwon closed out Sable Advisory Group's 2023 books at $318,000 in gross revenue. My Schwab account cleared $154,000. The Inman Park condo was appraised at $431,000. Then last Tuesday, Robert Anand called me at 8:47 in the morning. Marcus's attorney filed a motion yesterday, he said. They're claiming the information you presented at Thanksgiving was obtained through improper means. They're arguing coercion and that the trust challenge was coordinated in bad faith. I was quiet for a moment. They're also claiming, Robert continued, that Nora's recording may have been made without proper consent under Georgia's wiretapping statute. I put the phone on speaker, opened the bottom drawer of my desk, pulled out a manila folder, not the one from Thanksgiving, a different one. Inside it was a document dated November 22, 2023, the day before Thanksgiving. A 1-page memorandum from Robert Annan's office, addressed to me, outlining Georgia's single-party consent recording statute and confirming that a party to a conversation may legally record it. In Georgia, Nora was at the location. She was present. She was the recorder. Also in the folder, Robert's filing confirmation from the probate court, timestamped November 8, 2023. Predating Thanksgiving by 15 days. Predating anything Marcus could call retaliatory or reactive. I'd been waiting for this. So, what do you think? Did Marcus go too far, or was Nora's recording the real game changer? Drop it in the comments and subscribe so you're here for what happens at the February hearing.